Hello everyone, I am Interact and welcome to Entity Education, a series in which my aim is to help newer players of Dead by Daylight learn some basics and eventually more advanced techniques and knowledge in order to get better and improve their gameplay in Dead by Daylight. Now before we get started, I just wanted to say that while I have been playing Dead by Daylight since beta and I've been to some of the highest ranks in the game, I don't believe myself to be the best player ever or anything like that. I'm not going to be a professional, I'm not the best player in the game by any stretch of the imagination. These videos are going to focus on mechanics in the game that aren't very well explained by a behavior or the tooltips in the game, as well as things that might take you either a lot of playtime to understand, or that would require you to dig deep in the wiki to understand. So with that, let's get down to the basics of playing Killer. The first place to start on how to play Killer would be the UI. I'll pull up right now. You can see what the typical UI will look like during a match as Killer in Dead by Daylight. No matter what killer you are playing, you'll be able to see the survivors' names and health states in the bottom left of your screen. This is what a healthy survivor looks like. This is what an injured survivor looks like. This is what a survivor who has been downed and can be picked up and put on a hook looks like. This is what a survivor who is currently hooked looks like. Note the progress bar at the bottom of the downed and hooked survivors. Once that reaches 0, the survivor will die, but we'll have more on that later. And this is what a dead survivor looks like. The wavy skull, for lack of a better term, is supposed to mean a survivor that has been sacrificed to the entity by putting them on a hook, and the solid skull, once again for lack of a better term, is supposed to mean that the survivor has either bled out or been killed by a Mori or a special perk or add-on. I say supposed to because in both cases the game seems to kind of get confused sometimes. Just know that if you see a skull, that player is dead and won't be able to do anything other than leave the game or spectate their fellow survivors until the match ends. And this last one is if a survivor disconnects. Disconnecting means that they have left the game completely, or their internet has cut out, and they will get 0 score. Why anyone would actually manually disconnect from a game is beyond me, but you may see it happen from time to time. Just note that that is what the icon looks like. Now the next thing is right above the survivors' health states and names is the amount of generators that need to be finished for the survivors to power the exit gates, and right next to that is your power. Now, the amount of generators will update as survivors repair generators, which is their main objective to winning the game. Just know that once it reaches 0, the generator icon will disappear and change to a large Find the Exit text. This means that the survivors will go to one of 2 exit gates, which you can see lit up on screen, and attempt to power them up and then leave. Now next to that I said you have your power icon. This varies from killer to killer. Sometimes it will show you an amount of power that you have. Like in the case of the Trapper, it will show you how many traps that you have currently held. Sometimes it will show you the cooldown for your power, as in the case of the Spirit, where it will show you how much longer you have before it refills and is able to be used again. And sometimes it will just remind you that you have a power, which can be used infinitely, like in the case of the Hillbilly. I'll be doing a video after this one to go into detail about each killer's power and how it works, and the ins and outs of them, so look forward to that video if you want to know more about a certain killer's mechanics. That'll be coming soon, TM. In the middle of your screen, you'll see prompts depending on what situation you're in, what killer you're playing, and what you can interact with on the map. I'll go into detail about what these mean later on in the video, but just know that if you're ever confused about what you can do in a certain situation, you can probably find the prompt, the button to press, or the progress bar in the bottom middle of your screen. Now on the far bottom right of your screen, you'll see all of your perks. I'll detail perks in another later video, going into detail about every perk and what they do, their uses, etc. But just know that if you forget what perks you're running, or you're using a perk that lights up when it's active or has a certain amount of stacks or whatever, you can find it down in the bottom right. Now moving on to things that might show up on your UI but won't be in a fixed position. These things will typically be highlighted in red. The most basic of these will be the actual position of the generators scattered about the map. This way, you can know where survivors will typically be hanging around and where you'll need to be defending to stop them from progressing the generators any further. In certain other cases, you may see survivors highlighted in red. Some perks will do this in special cases, but once again, I'll cover that in the perk video. And you may see a little bone totem highlighted in red if you're running what is known as a hex perk. Once again, cover that in the perk video. Once you've downed and picked up a survivor, all the hooks on the map will appear highlighted in red as well. This will show you where you can drop off your picked up survivor. Now let's move on to notifications. These will appear on your screen under certain situations. The most basic of these is just a red arrow pointing in a direction that will appear in the middle of your screen. This basically is just there to tell you, hey, something happened over here. These typically show up whenever basically anything happens, but if you get lost, they're nice to kind of get your bearings back, but for the most part, you'll just ignore them. Another basic notification is the generator notification. These will happen once the survivors have completed a generator. You'll hear a sound, you'll see the generator highlighted in yellow for a little bit with a large black circle around it. This means the survivors have completed that generator and are one step closer to finishing the game. Don't worry though, you'll see this very frequently, but they still need to complete all 5 in order to get those exit gates powered. The next notification you may see is just called the noise notification. These essentially just exist to tell you that something happened in a specific location. These will show up if a survivor misses a skill check, vaults a window quickly, drops a pallet, jumps into a locker quickly, or one of your hex totems has been destroyed. General things like that. These just serve to show you that something is going on in that area in case you're lost and can't find survivors. For the most part, unless you're completely lost and can't find a survivor anywhere, you should just keep a mental note of where they happened so you know that there is survivors in that general area. And you should definitely ignore them if you're already chasing down a survivor, because these are just distractions and you should focus on the survivor in front of you. But make sure to keep a mental note of that so you know, okay, they're in this general area of the map. The next major thing you may notice is random orange cuts or scratches all over the walls and floors of the map. These are known as scratch marks, and they are left behind by survivors who are sprinting around. These are helpful for figuring out where survivors are running and tracking them down. They are extremely random and spread out, so they can only really give you a general idea of where the survivor is running, but they can be helpful once you learn how to track them down and you learn the ins and outs of them. This will take time and practice to get down, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to, follow the tracks fairly easily. A quick minor thing to note is that when you do an action that awards you blood points, you'll see it appear briefly on the left side of your screen with an icon denoting what category it's in, the number of BP you got, and the name of what you did to get you this score. It will also have a red circle that will show you how much progress you have towards maxing out each category. This isn't really something to worry too much about, but it's good to know in case you're wondering how many points you get for doing something or what category an action belongs to. Once again, very minor thing, just ignore it for the most part. Your score is tallied at the end screen and will have a breakdown of what you did to get each score anyways, so for the most part, unless you're curious, how many points do I get for hitting someone, just kind of know that it shows up on the left side, but for the most part, you'll want to ignore it. Moving on to the next portion of the guide, I just want to talk briefly about maps and map generation in Dead by Daylight. Now, as we talked about, every map spawns with generators, totems, and exit gates, as well as you and 4 survivors. There are many maps in Dead by Daylight, and some of them fall under certain realms of map, which is what behavior calls them. For instance, there are multiple maps in the Coldwind Farms realm. There are currently, as the making of this video, 5 Coldwind Farms maps: Fractured Cowshed, the Thompson House, Torment Creek, Rancid Abattoir, and Rotten Fields. All of these maps fall under the Coldwind Farms realm because they will feature assets and a visual theme of the Coldwind Farms realm. For instance, they will all have wooden jungle gym structures, cornfields, and farming equipment and farming buildings. However, each particular map will have a distinctly different setup and play differently. You'll be able to tell when you're on Fractured Cowshed as opposed to the Thompson House, for instance, because Fractured Cowshed will always have the titular Cowshed, and the Thompson House will always have the titular Thompson House. These maps will always have the same size and boundaries. However, the other things I talked about will be randomly generated. This means if you played 2 games back to back on, say, the Thompson House, while the Thompson House will always be in the same place, the generators, pallets, totems, and obstacles won't. Behavior has some sort of algorithm. I assume. I haven't actually taken a look into their code personally, but this is the way that they've said they work on this, and the way that other people who perhaps have looked at their code say that it works. But this determines where things will spawn anytime you're placed into a map. This can mean that while 2 games played on the Thompson House will feel similar, since it's the same tile set and map and you can see the same big Thompson House as a landmark, the generators and everything else might be shuffled around. This is a nice touch in my opinion because it keeps the game from getting stale quickly and from people making an optimal strategy for every certain map. Thanks, behavior. Now, as I said, certain iconic parts of the map will always be spawned in, the big landmarks. And every map will have a basement with 4 unbreakable hooks and what is called a killer shack, with a few exceptions, but what rule doesn't have exceptions? The basement will only ever spawn in 2 points that can be chosen from, once again with a few exceptions, depending on the map. And these points will typically be in the killer shack, or in the large iconic building that the map is named after. There are a few other things that aren't randomized, such as the killer shack always having 2 open doors and a window, and one of the doors having a pallet on it, or the basement always having a chest in it. You and the survivors will also spawn randomly into the map. The survivors have the chance to spawn all together, all separate, or in pairs. You can always be sure that you won't spawn with a survivor right on top of you, unless you get an extremely bugged game. But depending on the map and its size, you might have a general idea of where they've spawned, since survivors typically spawn close to generators, and far away from you. Once again, as with some things, I can't really boil this down to mathematics or give you a surefire way of knowing where they've spawned. It's just kind of something you get a feel for once you've played the game for a while, and you've gone through a lot of iterations of the same map, and you go, okay, I spawned here, that means they've spawned either X, Y, or Z. Now that we've gotten into the basics about the UI and the map's semi-randomization, let's talk about how the actual game will function and some things you'll want to know when you're out in the killing fields trying to get sacrifices for the entity and her honestly creepy claws. The first thing that you should know is you have what is called a terror radius. This isn't something you will notice at all, but it is a passive thing that all killers have, and it will give the survivors an idea of when you're nearby. The base terror radius is 32 meters, but it will vary based on what killer you're playing, what perks, add-ons, etc. Once again, we'll go into that in another video. But just know that when you're within at least 32 meters of a survivor, they will hear a loud heartbeat. The heartbeat will get more intense the closer you get to them, so they'll have some idea of how close you are, even if they can't see you. Once you engage in a chase with a survivor, which means you're behind them, they're in front of you, you're running after them, aka chasing, the heartbeat will be replaced by chase music for you and that survivor. All other survivors will still hear the heartbeat. This will either end when you down the survivor, or you lose the survivor in the chase, or the game bugs out in certain cases. Speaking of chases, let's now get into how a typical chase might go. Once you notice the survivor and start running towards them, the chase music will start playing for both of you, so you'll know you're in the chase. They'll typically try to dodge you by jumping through windows, throwing down pallets, or just breaking line of sight and hiding. Make sure you use those scratch marks and noise notifications we talked about earlier to track them and catch up to them and give them a good smack on the head. Once you've hit them, if they were healthy, they'll gain a short burst of speed and become injured. You'll slow down a bit and clean your weapon because apparently all the killers are neat freaks or something despite being covered in blood all the time. This will slow you down for a bit and speed them up and essentially restart the chase. However, if you catch them again while they're injured, they'll go into a downed state. From here, you can either leave them on the ground and they'll crawl around slowly until they get help from a teammate. This is commonly referred to as slugging due to the slow speed that they go and the position that they're in. Or more often than not, you'll pick them up, throw them over your shoulder like a bride of old, and then try to find a hook to throw them up on, to sacrifice them to the entity. Another important thing to note about chases is once you get the first hit on them, survivors will start bleeding and making pained sounds, because, you just hit them with a giant weapon, and that probably really hurts. But this gives you two new things to use to track them down, in addition to, your eyes and the scratch marks. This brings me to a brief side point about Dead by Daylight, and playing it in general. Sound is really important in this game. You should be wearing the best headphones you can get and using sound as much as you can in this game. Listening to music or other things while playing isn't really advised, since you might miss out on a lot of sound cues that this game gives you. It's a very sound-oriented game. You can hear the survivors breathing, you can hear the survivors moaning in pain, you can hear them bandaging themselves, you can hear even the grass rustling when they walk by you. So get some good headphones and use them. Now getting back to the game, once you have someone on a hook, that's basically it. You're done with them. You can't hit them anymore or anything. I mean, you can, but it doesn't do anything once they're on the hook. You just have to wait for the timer at the bottom that we talked about to run out, or hope a teammate comes to take them down off the hook. This brings up the progress bar that we talked about. Now, the first time you hook a survivor, the bar will be completely full and will slowly start ticking down with time. Before it hits 50%, they can attempt to self-unhook, commonly referred to as Kobeing, but this only has a 4% chance to work every time they attempt it, and will eat up a large portion of the progress bar, so typically most people won't try and do it. They can attempt this 3 times before it puts their bar below 50%, in which they will enter what is called the struggle state. Once in the struggle state, they can no longer attempt to self-unhook, and they just have to sit there and mash a button over and over and struggle until they either give up on mashing the button because they're tired, or the bar runs out and they dies, or a survivor comes to unhook them. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well geez, I guess I should just sit nearby and wait for the progress bar to hit 0 so I get the kill, right? Because the bar is going really slowly. Don't worry. If you have hooked someone, and you throw them up on hook for a second time, even if they were unhooked instantly for some reason, they will automatically go into the struggle state. Their bar will automatically drop to 50%, and they'll be in the struggle state. And once you hook a survivor for the 3rd time, or hook a survivor that has made it to the struggle state from the first hook, because no one came to save them quickly enough, or they wasted their progress bar, they will automatically die. No questions asked. This brings us to another brief aside about the game. Say that you don't feel confident that they aren't going to get saved, and they're just going to escape, and you want to stay near the hook until they die. This is known as camping in the community and is typically frowned upon. However, there are no specific rules against it. I'll go into more detail about the, specific rules of the game, as some people call them, at the end of the video, but just know that this isn't typically the most efficient way to get kills, and you'll probably get a lot of hate messages if you do it. But it is technically valid within the confines of the game. Now, back to the game that we were playing. We put someone up on a hook and found another survivor. Go us, we're killing it. I hate myself for that pun. But what's this? A survivor isn't running away, they just keep going in a circle. What are they doing? Well, they're employing a technique known as looping. They're playing with that wooden pallet that you might see propped up against a wall or a tree or a rock or whatever. It's propped up against something. If they drop that pallet and it hits you, you'll get briefly stunned and make an angry or funny, depending on what killer you're playing, sound, and have a temporary wall between the two of you. You could choose to ignore the pallet and keep chasing after them, but more likely than not, they'll just keep running you around and around and around until you break it. Now you might be wondering, why would they ever drop it? How can I keep up with them when they're so nimble? Don't worry. Survivors who are running with their sprint are moving at what is referred to as 100% speed. In general, killers move at 115% speed, with a few exceptions, but this does mean that eventually, given enough time in a chase, you will catch up to them. Also, as the chase goes on long enough, you may notice an icon that looks like a viper skull appear on the right side of your screen, with a little chevron below it. This is called Bloodlust, and it has 3 tiers. You'll go up a tier of Bloodlust for every 15 seconds that you're in a chase and you haven't hit a survivor or broken a pallet, and it will increase your speed. Tier 1 will give you 5% more speed. Tier 2 will give you 10% on top of that, bringing you to a total of 15% more speed. And Tier 3 will give you an ungodly extra 15% more speed, bringing you to a total of 30% increased speed. How could survivors ever hope to escape you when you're such a speed demon? Well, as I said, you lose all stacks of Bloodlust every time you break a pallet or land a hit on a survivor. Well, now you might be saying, well geez, why would I ever break that pallet? I want that speed boost. I want to go fast. Well, 15 seconds is a long time in this game. That time that you're spending chasing this person around the pallet that you could just break and cut off their ability to play around it is time that their team is probably working on generators to get those exit gates powered. It's typically advisable to just break the pallet as soon as they drop it, especially at lower ranks and when you're newer to the game. Once you get further into the game and you learn map knowledge a little bit more, you'll learn what are called safe pallets and what are called unsafe pallets. I'll probably do a video on this later, but honestly, I don't personally know what every pallet is safe or, which ones are unsafe. But for the most part, at lower ranks, as I said, just break the pallet and continue the chase. Another thing you might see the survivors using is a window. Now, unlike pallets, you can interact with windows as well. However, you don't go over them as quickly as they do. Typically, there's a route around the window that is designed so the killers can catch up without having to go through the window. But it does lose you a little bit of time. Now, once again, you might be thinking, well, geez, they're just going to keep running to that window, and I'll never be able to catch them because I have to go around and I lose time doing that. Well, don't worry, the entity and behavior have your back. If a survivor uses a window 3 times within a brief window, God, why do I do these puns? The entity will block it off with their magical claw things, and the survivor that has used that window will be unable to use it for a while, but you still can. For the most part, windows are just used by survivors to make you go that long way around, while they get a brief shortcut, giving them a little bit of difference to make up for the speed difference between you and them. You can sometimes get cool mind games on survivors who are looping or using windows, but that's a much more advanced technique that honestly I'm not even great at, but you may master it after a long time of playing killer, but that's something that, will be far down the line if you just started playing. So don't worry about that, just break the pallet, go around the window, and keep the chase going. Now, the last thing to talk about is hitting survivors. Once you catch up to them, outside of using your power that might help you depending on what killer you are, every killer has a basic weapon that they can use to just smack survivors upside the head. The thing about this, however, is that secretly there are 2 ways to actually hit them with the weapon. You can do a normal attack where you'll swing your weapon quickly at them, or you can hold down the attack button and you'll do what is called a lunge, where you get a short bit of distance at the cost of the attack taking slightly longer to land and slightly longer to recover from. If you're right on top of a survivor, the basic swing has more auto-aim to it, since the game was designed for consoles. So even if they're trying to juke right or left or run in a circle around you, it'll probably land without too much manual adjustment from you. The lunge, on the other hand, should only be used if you think you're close enough to land a hit right before they get to that window or pallet, but it does come at that risk. You get less auto-aim, so it's easier for them to juke left or right or circle around you, and the recovery time is slightly higher, as I said, so if you miss, you're going to get really punished for trying to lunge. This is another thing that you'll get a feel for once you've played a bit and tried out each different attack. You'll know which situation you should do just the basic hit and which situations you should be lunging for, and how close to a window or a pallet you can lunge and actually land the hit. That's something that I don't think you can break down mathematically. It's kind of just a game feel type deal. So once you've played enough, you'll get a feel for it. Don't worry about that. Now, you might be wondering, is there any way you can stop the survivors from working on the generators outside of just chasing them off of it and putting them on hooks? Sometimes, maybe you just can't seem to find a survivor to chase, but the generators still seem to be getting worked on somehow. Well, if you walk up to any generator with progress on it and hold down the spacebar, you'll kick the generator and put it into what is called the regression state, and it will slowly, emphasis on slowly, go back down towards 0 progress. This takes a very long time, and if any survivor walks up to the generator and starts working on it for even just a microsecond, the regression stops. You can tell how progressed generators are based on how fast the pistons are moving and how many of them are moving. The more pistons moving and the faster they're moving, the closer it is to being fully completed. Now, when you kick the generator, it will give off sparks, which is important because, as I said, even if they touch it for a microsecond, the regression stops. The sparks also stop. This can be useful to track it from a distance, because you can sort of see the sparks a lot easier than you can see pistons moving and whatnot. Kicking generators is an important thing to do sometimes, but as I said, the regression is slow and it takes a while to actually get up to the generator and kick it, so try to save it for generators that you know you can defend easily and are pretty close to being done, just to try and slow them down a slight bit, or use it to track survivors coming up to it and touching it to stop the regression based on whether you can see the sparks or not. Now, the last thing that I said that I wanted to touch on is the community has these quote-unquote rules that they have defined for the game. And I also want to touch a bit on toxicity in Dead by Daylight. Some people in the community, not everyone, but some people, seem to think that there are these rules that the community has come up with on how you're supposed to play or allowed to play Dead by Daylight. They think things like, oh, if I self-unhook myself, you're not allowed to hit me. Or, if you camp or tunnel, you're gonna get banned. Or, you have to give the last survivor the hatch. Or using perks like No-Ed, which is no one escapes death, or Decisive Strike is toxic, and other nonsense. It's just not true. The only things that behavior the developers of this game have come out and said are bannable offenses are the obvious things like hacking, cheating, exploiting bugs, or being generally toxic in the chat by using, offensive slurs or racial slurs, homophobic slurs, anything like that. Or what is referred to as holding the game hostage, in which you block a survivor and do not allow them to leave the game, basically making the game last for an infinite amount of time. Those are bannable offenses. If you want to camp someone, or tunnel someone, or use No One Escapes Death, or use Decisive Strike, or use whatever add-ons are in the game, go for it. If it's in the game, it's fair play to be used. Now, be warned that this community can be, I put an emphasis on can be, toxic sometimes. So if you do those things, you may get hateful messages. As with any online game, there are some bad seeds. If you get hateful messages, block them, ignore them, move on with your life. Do not dwell on it, do not respond to them, just block them, report them if they said anything extremely hateful, and move on with your life. And that brings us to the end of the first Entity Education video. If you have any additional questions, feel free to leave a comment on the video or drop by my Twitch stream, and I'll try and answer your questions as best as I can. I plan to do more videos in the future about certain topics, as I said, like specific killers and their powers, and specific add-ons or perks and their uses, so look forward to those in the future, and I'll cover topics that people ask the most questions about as best as I can. Once again, thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a like on the video if you liked it, and subscribe for more in the future. I do appreciate it. I'll see you next time.